Welcome everybody to this session of Raising Peace's Peace Festival that's being held in the lead up to the United Nations International Day of Peace on the 21st of September. And just to confirm you're in the right place, this is a session which has the title AUKUS, Perspectives from the USA, the UK and Australia. My name is Nick Dean and I'm speaking to you from Sydney, from land that originally belonged to the Gadigal people and from whom it was taken away through violence. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, Raising Peace is a network of more than 30 organisations working together to share ideas, knowledge and inspiration towards a more peaceful world. To learn a bit more about the network, you'd have to go to our website, raisingpeace.org.au. This session, like all the others, will be recorded and the recording will be placed on the website in the next week or so. During the session, please remain muted. If you have questions, comments or resources to share, please put them into the chat and if possible, avoid engaging in debate through the chat. Now that's all from me. I'd like to hand over now to our facilitator for the session, Keith Suter. Keith wears many hats. Amongst other things, he's the managing director of the Global Directions think tank. So over to you, Keith.
Thanks very much indeed, Nick. I join with others in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, which is the land of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora nation, and I pay tribute to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. So we have three speakers from three continents looking at last year's agreement. And so the first speaker will be from Australia, and it's Bruce Haigh, who's a retired diplomat and a political commentator, and whose writings appear in a number of outlets, including regional newspapers, etc. Kate Hudson is joining us from the United Kingdom, and she's the General Secretary of the UK Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and that's the leading peace group, I think, in the United Kingdom. And you can see in her description that she's been involved in a number of areas relating to peace and conflict studies. And she's a leading anti-nuclear, anti-war campaigner and an author of a number of books. And then we will cross to Brunswick, Maine, the northeast of the United States. And Bruce Gagnon is the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and was its co-founder when it was created 30 years ago. He was also a Vietnam-era Air Force veteran who then became a peace activist while he was working in the military. So you've got these three individuals who will offer different national perspectives on the new defence alliance between Australia, UK and US, AUKUS, and we will finish in 55 minutes time. So what we'll do is we'll start off with Bruce Haigh in Australia, to be followed by Kate Hudson in the United Kingdom, and then Bruce Gagnon. I've got two Bruces on the program coming in from the United States. So can we invite Bruce Haigh to speak for 10 minutes on the issue of Australia's perspective on AUKUS. It will then be followed by Kate Hudson and then be followed by Bruce Gagnon. And then we will have about 25 minutes for questions. And as Nick has said, could you put your questions in the chat box? Over to you, please, Bruce Haigh.
Thank you very much, Keith, and nice to meet the other participants. AUKUS has crept up on the Australian people very quickly. We've got a situation. There's no AUKUS agreement. It's the most strange situation. Nothing has been put before the Australian Parliament, and nothing has really been put into the public domain. There is an agreement that's going to be signed in February, but it's very, very limited. It relates to the exchange of information on nuclear technology as it relates to submarines, and that's it. Now, everybody's talking, particularly the media in Australia, the Murdoch media, but the ABC, are talking about AUKUS as a fixed identity. My belief is that AUKUS came into being not long before the last government lost the election. The Americans could see that Morrison, who was the Prime Minister, was unlikely to be re-elected, and he was their safest bet, together with Dutton, who was the Minister for Defence, in getting an arrangement in place that would enable the Americans to base and increase the size of their forces in Australia. They can do, some of it can come under existing arrangements that we've got, but none of those existing arrangements have been mentioned in terms of the proposals that keep being leaked into the press. So AUKUS at the moment, AUKUS began with the cancelling of the submarine deal between Australia and France to build, Australia was to get French submarines. That deal was cancelled. It's my belief that that was instigated by the Americans, who wanted the French out of the region in terms of confronting China. The Americans see that this is their game, and they want to run it, and so they did not want the French involved on a long-term basis in what is going to be a confrontation, or is already a confrontation, but an increasing confrontation between China and the United States. Britain is also ran in this, and I don't know where they're going to get the money to extend themselves on a permanent basis east of the Suez. That was a Boris Johnson folly. They've got enough on their plate without having to worry about as I say, extending themselves to this part of the world. On the other hand, the Conservatives in England are very anti-China, so it fits into that agenda, particularly of trust. So the submarine deal was cancelled, and new submarines were going to be ordered from the Americans and from the British, either or perhaps both. It subsequently transpired that the United States capacity to build submarines for Australia is zero, and the same with the United Kingdom. They're so tied up building their own new versions of submarines, they've got no space to build an Australian submarine. It is my contention that it was never a proposition that Australia get nuclear submarines. It was always a smokescreen for the Americans to base their submarines here, and that's what they're setting out to do. Stirling, which is a naval base in Western Australia, just very close to Perth, is being upgraded to take American nuclear submarines, and the Americans, or the Australians and the Americans, are looking for a site on the eastern coast, maybe Newcastle, Wollongong, to build another submarine base out of mid-range of Chinese missiles. The submarines will also be able to be based in Darwin, but only on a short-term basis because of the security threat posed by Chinese capacity. So the Americans have already said, and the British are taking personnel from the Australian Navy to train them on their nuclear submarines. That's purely show. It's not. There's nothing of substance in that. I think what will happen is that we'll have American submarines based in Australia that have got Australian crew on board, and they'll be called joint operational items of equipment, and they'll get around the problem. And there'll be talk that, yes, we'll get the submarines, but in the meantime, in the interim, this arrangement will cover the gap, or words to that effect. There's been no serious discussion. If Australia really wants submarines, there's been no serious discussion about getting off-the-shelf submarines which exist, or doing a redesigned Collins class submarine. So that's that part of AUKUS. The rest of AUKUS seems to be increasing the size of facilities in Australia to take on American troops and American equipment. So the Tyndall Air Force Base in the north of Australia is being substantially enlarged. There's the new airstrip is going to be over 2 miles long, and it's getting parking facilities for major aircraft and tankers. There are fuel storage facilities being built in Darwin and again at Tyndall. What they call the joint facility at Pine Gap has been doubled in size to basically to watch China and to have China in its scope for all sorts of reasons. That is for observation and also for armed operations and for satellite warfare and so forth and so on. But that's a joint facility in name only. There are a lot of aspects of that facility which Australia is not privy to. So other facilities in Australia, no doubt, will be expanded to assist the Americans. Now, the Americans' intention is to establish the north of Australia as a zone of confrontation of China. In the Second World War, America used Australia as a jumping off point to launch its attacks against the Japanese in the island. So Australia became a bread bowl and also a training base for large numbers of American troops and so on. The idea now is to turn the north of Australia into a place from which America can, certainly intimidate and threaten China, but if necessary, to carry out offensive operations against China, either with respect to Taiwan or with respect to the South China Sea, or both. So our new Minister for Defence, Miles, who's been absolutely swamped by the Washington lobbyists, now talks about the Australian Defence Force having an interchangeable capacity with the United States forces. That will mean that the United States will direct Australian naval and air assets, because they'll be integrated into American formations. It means that they'll probably establish a joint command center in Darwin, which will be basically run by the Americans, and that will be, they'll put a large zone with Darwin at the center around the northern parts of Australia, including the ocean, and any aircraft that fly into that zone will need to report to this particular facility, and the same with vessels that are in that zone. They'll need to report to this facility, and other operations, no doubt, will be run in all the patrols that the Americans are doing in the South China Sea, and air operations that Australia's doing with its P3s in the shipping lanes and close to the Chinese coast will be, I think, managed from this new facility. None of this has been put before the Australian Parliament, and none of it has been put before the Australian people. The Labor Party, which was then in opposition, was given 24 hours to look at the arrangements, whatever they may be. In the last term of the Parliament of the previous government, the Americans had asked that the opposition, as it then was, be given more time, 2 or 3 weeks, to look at these so-called arrangements, but they weren't. Morrison didn't. But the Labor Party here, who's now in government, in order not to be wedged before the last election, agreed to them after the most cursory of examination. Now, those papers, whatever they are, have never been tabled in Parliament. We don't know what they contain. They could be a series of dot points. They could be notes. They could be a broad outline of the arrangements that I've just been mentioning here. None of that is in the public domain, and the Labor Party now isn't releasing it. They, as I say, they have been swamped by the very quickly swamped by the American military-industrial complex. And it's, as time goes by, it seems that that's becoming more entrenched. And the moves that our foreign minister was making to re-establish good links with China are at best on ice or have been marginalized by these particular forces. It would be my contention that the Americans are preparing for war against China, and they want it, and they want to give China a flick. They want to put China in its place. They believe that they can do it. And it's the most mistaken belief, I think, that the Americans have ever had. And that includes Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's their DNA of the American military-industrial complex just is fixed on warfare and producing weapons of war, and then ultimately using those weapons. And there's just an inevitability about what's happening. And the fact that they've seen Australia as such a patsy and is so convenient for advancing these plans. We know that the Americans are increasing the capacity of Guam and no doubt other facilities that they've got. The Chinese are not stupid, and they see all this happening. And of course, they are trying to put themselves in a position to counter these moves. And every move they make is portrayed as offensive by the Murdoch media and other media outlets in Australia, including now the ABC, which is a government broadcaster in Australia, which once set the standards in Australia for journalism, has now succumbed to the whole anti-China psychology or push, and that's the danger. And I think,
Bruce, I think we better wind up at this point.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Thanks for that, Bruce. Can we now go off to the United Kingdom and invite Kate Hudson to speak? Kate in London.
Thanks very much indeed, Keith, and thanks for inviting me to this very timely event. It's a year now, of course, since the pact was announced, and we saw here that Australia was being drawn further and further into the US's military and strategic framework. The focus here in understanding what was going on, particularly from us in the anti-nuclear movement, was the centrepiece of the pact, this provision of nuclear-powered subs to Australia and all the questions it's raised around proliferation. Our understanding is that it's illegal under international law in the terms of the NPT and so on. But what has become clear over the past year is the inability of the US and the UK to actually provide these submarines for Australia. Certainly, as Bruce mentioned, in the short to medium term. And we're starting to think now that this means that other elements of the treaty are gaining more significance, and other ways are being developed to use Australia's geographical location and its resources for military purposes in the US build-up against China, which Bruce again was just talking about there. We see very clearly that the UK is playing its usual support role for the US, and in return, as usual, it hopes to get a lot out of it, financially, of course, and in other ways, global prestige or whatever it sees it as. So, for example, at the time of announcing the pact, the chair of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee commented, he said, bringing together the military-industrial complex of these three allies is a step change in the relationship. We've always been interoperable, but this aims at much more. We will be able to cost save by increasing platform sharing and innovation costs. Particularly for the smaller two countries, that's game-changing. So it's certainly in terms of British strategic thinking, this is a big factor. And in fact, when the pact was announced here in Britain, we still had Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. When he was announcing it in Parliament in his usual kind of bluff way, he gave the impression that there was going to be a big industrial boost to the defence sector as a result of the pact. I mean, you'd think it wasn't anything to do with global geopolitics or whatever. You'd think it was like a kind of arms sales deal. And he implied that sale of the submarine nuclear reactor units, the propulsion units to Australia would come from the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby. That's the factory that produces the reactors for UK subs. And of course, that was popular with some of the trade unions who thought, great, new jobs and so on. So it became a kind of bit of a contentious issue. But of course, as Bruce also touched on, this is looking unlikely, and any thought that Britain could build subs for Australia is just not viable. And Britain is currently building 2 classes of submarine, and it's struggling with both. I mean, the capacity for Britain to deliver these kinds of things it's just not really credible. So I'll just mention those 2 classes of subs. So first, there's the Astute Class, and this is the kind of sub that Australia is supposed to want, or that your government claims it wants, which is a so-called hunter-killer submarine. In other words, it's nuclear powered with conventional weapons. And the aim is to have 7 subs in this class. Now, they've been building these for 20 years. Only 5 have been completed, and there are still 2 to go. It's being built by BAE Systems at Barrow-in-Furness. The programme's running many years late, and it's facing massive cost overruns. And then, even though they're still building that, they're then looking to develop a successor to that class. I mean, it's like, I think BAE System once called it like a drumbeat of production. It's like a kind of bit of a gravy train. It just produce sub after sub after sub, except that they do have these productions problem. So the programme to develop the successor to this class in the 2040s, that's been delayed because of delays with the current production. So the Dreadnought Class, this is the other class that's being developed. This is the nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarines. There are 4 planned. There are 2 in manufacture. They were started in 2016, none yet completed. So they're running late. The first ones are expected early in the 2030s. And again, there are cost overruns. So who knows when these things will be produced. And in fact, there was a debate in the papers not very long ago speculating about whether these, the Dreadnought class, they would ever actually get to the production of 4 submarines. These are also built by BAE Systems at Barrow, and they're actually built in the same dock hall as the Astute class submarines. So there is 0 possibility of anything else being produced there. And in addition, there have been problems with the submarine reactor, the nuclear reactor to power the submarines. Problems with the ones currently in use. That's led to further delays with the new model. And there is also recognition of a huge skills shortage in the sector and a lack of capacity to take on extra work. So why our government was kind of leading other people to believe that this might be a possibility. I mean, who really knows? In April, the leaders of the 3 countries stated they were pleased with progress to establish the submarine capability. Why? And they also announced cooperation on a large range of military developments. So this is what we're looking to now in particular, to see what are these other developments that are coming on stream. So at that time, they said they were commencing new trilateral cooperation on hypersonics and counter-hypersonics. So the hypersonics is becoming a big deal now. Electronic warfare capabilities, information sharing, expansion, more cooperation on innovation, cyber, AI, quantum technologies, undersea capabilities, and so on. So a kind of massive expansion of cooperation in these areas. So although they're developing those new areas, it is hard to see why they say they're pleased with the submarine developments. As people will have seen, I'm sure, a few weeks ago, Rear Admiral Scott Pappano, who is in charge of the US Navy's nuclear submarine program, he said that helping Australia to acquire the nuclear subs directly from the US would be too much for the country's overburdened shipyards. So same story from the UK. He said, in fact, it would be detrimental to the US. And also the US have now said no to an Australian request for some existing Virginia-class subs. So it's like a big no. So no one knows where these supposed subs will come from. Could it be a new sub from the US further down the line, or US subs put together in Australia? Someone has even been talking about co-production from the three countries where there are bits from each. And I've even read now that it's being suggested that the French will come back in to provide subs, because in fact, the subs that the French were going to produce for the Australians were actually their own nuclear weapons sub, but with the weapons capability removed. So who really knows? But I was very interested to hear what Bruce said about why the Americans didn't want the French actually in the deal with Australia. So in June, the US Congress passed the Australia-United States Submarine Officer Pipeline Act, which would allow Australian naval officers to begin training in the US to operate the subs. And at the end of last month, a similar announcement was made here in the UK when Richard Marles was visiting, and he went on a trip with Boris Johnson to Barrow, to the shipyards in Barrow, for the launch of the 5th Astute Class sub. And it's been announced that Australian submariners will train on this and the other 4 Astute Class subs. So it seems like a bit of a consolation prize that, you know, you can send some of your officers here to be trained. But that's what the situation is looking like now. So I could say then that the submarine plans, well, they can be described as a sorry story of over-grandiose, undeliverable plans. But this can't detract from what AUKUS means in wider terms. Not only does it exemplify the UK government's vision of a global Britain that is big on the international military stage, that bases its economy on the arms industry, it's also a significant factor in the US's drive to maintain global dominance and its push into the Asia Pacific. And of course, Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan indicates the US is pushing hard in this direction without concern, seemingly, for the risks that are promoted. The dangers of AUKUS are widely recognised by other states in the region, many expressing concern about it. And of course, China recognises the specific dangers presented by AUKUS. And in fact, China raised the particular nuclear element at last month's NPT review conference in New York. And it said AUKUS would set a dangerous precedent and have a profound negative impact on global strategic balance and stability. So to conclude, Chair, I would say that international cooperation is needed between the movements in our countries and beyond, not only to oppose the specifics of the AUKUS agreement, but the whole escalatory framework of US policy. And of course, CND, my own organisation, supports the peaceful development of a multipolar world, not unipolar global military domination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. That was excellent. And we now just move to the United States and Bruce Gagnon to speak, please. Bruce, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. It's good to be with you. It's early here, but I'm happy to speak with you all on this very important topic. In 1997, the U.S. Space Command created a document called Vision for 2020, where they talked about the United States would control space, which would allow them to then control the Earth below as well. That everything, all warfare in these days is coordinated and directed by space technology. So it's very clear to me that the overarching goal of the United States is domination of the entire planet on behalf of corporate globalization. Joe Biden just this morning, I read just before we started here, was quoted as saying again that the United States will defend Taiwan. Although at the same time, he said the US still adheres to the US's one China policy. So essentially, the Biden administration is talking out of both sides of its mouth. But the US is indeed serious about going to war with China, as others have already said, just as we see the United States is willing to go to war with Russia today, using Ukraine as a hammer in its toolbox to try to take down Russia. A regime change in Moscow and a breakup of Russia into smaller nations, which would then allow Western corporations to control that vast resource base in Russia. Well, the same goal is in mind when it comes to China. Regime change in Beijing, breaking China up into pieces, which would allow the West to again take control of parts of that region, something they had at one time, and they've been sorry that they ever lost it. So clearly the United States is moving towards global war that is likely, if they continue on their present course, to turn nuclear. Just Kate a minute ago mentioned the multipolar world. This is a serious, serious issue right now. Just in the last days, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization met, and BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is growing. Both of those organizations are beginning to accept new members, and other countries are lining up to be part of this multipolar institution that are these institutions, I should say, that are going to challenge the domination of the Western corporate economic institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. So the US and the other countries in the West know that there's a massive challenge underway, and they're on the losing end of it. The West is maybe what, 20% of the world population as compared to the global South when you add them all up. And so they're very desperate in this moment as they see their long reign of colonial powers fading away. So clearly the United States and its agents, I would say within NATO, as they look at expanding NATO into a global military alliance, one that they hope will even replace the United Nations. Right now, US has to go to the UN Security Council to seek the unwilling agreement of Russia and China before they can go to war with anybody. But if they can create what they call this new global military alliance, then they think they won't be able to have to get anyone else's permission to go to war. They can just do it on their own. And so that's why we see this desperate expansion of NATO right now. Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, other countries in the Asia Pacific signed up as partners in this NATO expansion. And we see this ever expanding military bases on Guam, in South Korea, and on Jeju Island in South Korea, Okinawa, Philippines, all kinds of other places where the United States is expanding its operations. And as Bruce earlier said, US expanding its bases in Pine Gap and in Darwin and other parts of Australia. At the same time, I think an interesting case to follow is Rocket Lab in New Zealand. It was promised to the indigenous people of New Zealand that Rocket Lab would only launch civilian launches to study the climate change and things like that. But now Lockheed Martin has taken over that launch facility, and every single launch so far has been military. And I wonder, as the United States is creating a whole string of rocket launch facilities around the planet, and in every case, people are promised that they're going to be civilian, they're going to be for environmental studies, but in the end, the military takes them over, and Lockheed Martin seems to be a favorite factor in those takeovers. I wonder if they're at some point creating this capability that they will be able to launch multiple nuclear launches or even conventional launches against Russia and China as part of a global first strike strategy from this string of launch facilities around the world. It's something I think that we should be paying close attention to. The Pentagon clearly is into, as Bruce sort of alluded to, this idea of interoperability, that all the NATO countries have to buy their military hardware from the United States so that everything would be interoperable, that all the technologies of all the NATO countries would fit into the US warfighting program, which is, again, directed and coordinated by space technology. But in the end, the US would be the tip of the spear. The US would be in control. It reminds me of the days of the US NATO taking down of Yugoslavia, the bombing of Belgrade. Afterwards, after it was all over, I read in Aviation Week in Space Technology that the NATO countries asked to see the US satellite reconnaissance information about how these bombing raids of Yugoslavia came about. Were they successful or not? And the US, which was in charge of the tip of the spear at the time, would not even allow their own NATO partners to have access to that bombing information. This is the kind of situation that we're heading into in this current moment. And so Australia would just be this junior partner, as all the other NATO nations would be. And the United States would be the one deciding when to attack, how to attack. And anyway, so in the end, I think it's really crucial that this event is happening today. It's crucial that people in Australia are really talking about this, because I must say that in the United States, the peace movement, distracted and divided over Ukraine right now, is really not focusing that closely on the Asia Pacific region. And so we really need your leadership from your peace movement in the region. And everyone else, I noticed that Cora is on here on this call from the Philippines. We need the voices of groups in the Asia Pacific to really show great leadership at this time. And I promise you that we'll do everything that we can to help amplify that. But most peace groups in the United States are just really behind the 8 ball when it comes to this particular issue. I thank you all very much for inviting me.
Thanks very much indeed, Bruce Gagnon. We've now got some time for questions. We invite people to put questions into the chat box, which is right down the bottom of your screen. We've got a number of, we've got observations from Kate and Bruce Gagnon, who, if you go through the chat, are giving us links for material that you can obtain via those links. We've also got a number of questions, so we can go through the questions. So we have Annette Brownlee here in Australia, IPAN, and she's saying that there's a risk of a war with China. And so her question, she talks to Bruce. You've got to bear in mind we've got two Bruces, but I think she's saying to Bruce here in Australia, what are your thoughts on how we build alliances with progressive Labor, Greens and independent politicians? So Bruce Haigh in the first instance to comment on this.
Well, it's a good question. The leadership of the Labor Party, Parliamentary Labor Party, has been captured by the by ASPI and the US military-industrial complex. Albanese's not that bright, and he's also not that strong. So he's good on some domestic issues, but on foreign policy and defence, he's not. Penny Wong is and could be, but she's been marginalised by the forces in Albanese's office and by ONI, which is headed up by Shearer. So what Albanese did, mistakenly, was to just keep on board all the people who had been advising the previous government. And of course, that was his inclination, was not to rock the boat. And that's what's happened. Now, as far as forming alliances, I alluded earlier to the ABC and the fact that the ABC really now is running a fairly anti-China line. The Murdoch press, it's hard to see where alliances might be formed. The independents are still maturing politically. You've got people like Andrew Wilkie, who's very experienced. So the trade unions are strong, but a number of the universities, as well in WA and in Sydney University, have very strong Australia-US studies departments, which are anti-China and pro what the US is doing. It's a bit like organising against the Vietnam War. It will have to come down to street activity, I think, and quite a big street activity where the media can't ignore what's happening. So those voices that are now against AUKUS need to talk to each other, get together and work out some strategies to force the media to report what the situation is. Because the media left to itself, people like Bill Birtles and Andrew Green are not going to do it. They're quite hopeless. So that would be my thought at this stage, but it's worthy of all those groups getting together and to start to have collectively and to start talking.
And I might just say that in the chat box, we've got another comment from Annette Brownlee from IPAN, who reminded us of the history of the Vietnam War when there was no support from the ALP, but eventually you did get people, thanks to the work of the unions and community movement, eventually you did get opposition within the ALP. So when the people lead, the leaders will follow. Now, there's another question from ASPI, which for our overseas viewers, that's a think tank very heavily influenced by the arms industry. And in a recent document, according to Colin Mitchell, it recommended that AUKUS expand into the area of the military use of space, amongst other areas. So what we're seeing with AUKUS is not just an anti-Chinese alliance, but maybe other areas as well. Do any of the three speakers want to comment on that? How about we ask Bruce Gagnon to start with? Do you have any comment on the expansion of AUKUS beyond what we've got? You were hinting at it in your presentation.
Yeah, I think it's something that you should be paying attention to, something that is going to be coming. Years ago, the military-industrial complex in the US said that Star Wars, the generic term for using space for warfare, would be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. And they said in Space News, an industry publication editorial, that we've got to be responsible corporate citizens and come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for all this because it's so expensive. And they said, we have, and we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure it. And they said the funding source was the entitlement programs that in the US officially are Social Security, the retirement for the elderly, Medicare, the medical care for the elderly, Medicaid, medical care for the poor, and what's left of the social safety net. So these are the programs that the military-industrial complex is currently trying to destroy in the United States to fund Star Wars. But still, that's not enough. And so now they've been sent with their golden cup to go around to the allies around the world to help get them to pay for it. And what they're promising, of course, is jobs. And this is one of the things that we see with these launch sites that they're always talking about springing up. I know in the UK, there's a whole bunch of them now under consideration. And they always promise lots of jobs and lots of money and all that kind of thing. So this is something that I can promise you that they're going to be trying increasingly to draw Australia, New Zealand, other Asia Pacific partners. South Korea is already being pulled into it. Japan's pulled into it. So this is part of your future as well.
Kate, do you want to comment on this? You're on
Not particularly, because I agree with what Bruce says, and he's absolutely right about these launch sites, space sites that are proliferating. Well, planning of them is proliferating here in the UK, so dangerous.
Yeah, thank you. And Bruce Haigh, do you want to comment?
No, it's frightening stuff, but no, not anymore.
Yeah. And it is interesting that here in Australia, we are seeking to enter the space race. And of course, we've had a long tradition of being involved with British nuclear exploration, nuclear testing, etc., on the mainland. And also we're now moving into the space race ourselves. Nick Dean asks a question really for all of the speakers. Is there any possibility of a legal challenge to Australia's planned acquisition of nuclear submarines? We've had hints from the speakers about NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, deciding that it's illegal to do this. Kate, you raised this in your presentation. Let me start with you. What about the legal implications of what is going on here? Are you involving lawyers in the debate over AUKUS in the UK? I'm one of your members, Kate, but I'm not informed on this issue.
Well, we do from time to time get legal opinions, and we have on occasion had a legal challenge to government. The last time we did a legal challenge was in 2002 over whether or not it would be legal for Britain to go to war on Iraq on the basis of the then UN resolution, without a further resolution. And we sort of got through one stage, and then we were told, well, it wasn't in the national interest to discuss it or take it any further. And that's what you hit up against, because when the government announced at the beginning of last year that it was going to increase the nuclear arsenal and increase the number of scenarios in which it would be willing to use nuclear weapons, we got a legal opinion on that from really top flight lawyers, and they found that both things were illegal under international law, i.e. contravened the NPT. And I'm absolutely certain that they would find the same thing to be the case with the AUKUS proposals, because when Boris Johnson announced AUKUS in Parliament, he said that it wasn't against the NPT because it was peaceful use of nuclear energy, or it was use of nuclear energy, not nuclear weapons. But of course, the NPT says you can use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. So how is powering military submarines for escalating a kind of regional tension, whatever, how is that a peaceful purpose? It's not. So clearly it would be illegal. But getting that to stick, and getting that to actually impact on the actions of governments, forget it. So I think it's useful to have a legal opinion in your back pocket, so to speak, but that can't be what stops these things happening. These states just ride roughshod over it.
And Bruce Haigh, are you following any of the legal debate in Australia?
Look, the development of Sterling in Western Australia for nuclear submarines, that could be a legal challenge, because you're talking about safety issues for Perth and Fremantle. And the same with if a site is selected at, say, Newcastle or Wollongong, the councils or the mayors and councils and so on could presumably bring a legal challenge against having their port turned into a target. But I tend to think that the money that's being poured into Australia from the industrial military complex is so much, and it's being spent without any oversight. And such is the way of the Australian government now, that the illegalities involved with the NPT haven't really impacted on them. They don't care. And it comes after the rule of law in Australia has been so fundamentally undermined by its treatment of refugees and the funding of refugees and where that money came from, and the fact that Australia paid off people smugglers in Sri Lanka and Indonesia with slush funds with no parliamentary accountability, to me means that they'd be quite prepared to do it in the growing hysteria of the anti-China lobby and the hysteria that's being whipped up quite deliberately against China. So we're moving into a war footing with AUKUS and the arming, if you like, of Northern Australia without even knowing it. We're being boiled slowly like the frog, and that's the worry at this stage.
In the comments, we've got from Bernadette McPhee, who's talking about some sort of international coalition to oppose AUKUS. This is obviously a good way to start if we can get the peace movements in all three countries to work together. And she gives us the Anti-AUKUS Coalition, or one word, .org. So please let us know if you wish to remain anonymous and not to be published. But they're obviously trying to get support for that. That's from Bernadette McPhee promoting that, because this is obviously a very obvious takeout from tonight's gathering. If we can get peace movements across the three continents all working together on this anti-AUKUS approach. Bruce Gagnon, 2/3 of the world's lawyers live in the United States. Are you getting any of the lawyers mobilized on this issue?
No, I'm afraid we don't have enough money to do that. But one thing I wanted to comment on is that Indonesia and Malaysia have been very vocal about this AUKUS program, especially the proliferation dangers. I think that it would be worth, and maybe this is already being done, I just don't know, but I would imagine that Australian peace groups should be reaching out to comparable people in Indonesia and Malaysia to see if there might be some interest in working together on this, especially when their governments have already been expressing concerns about this. So that might be something. The other thing I want to mention is the IAEA, which we've just seen go into Ukraine to look at the nuclear power plant that Ukraine has been shelling repeatedly. There's overwhelming evidence that they've been shelling it, and that the IAEA came out of there and wouldn't even acknowledge that it was being shelled by Ukraine. At the same time, when it comes to this AUKUS proliferation dangers, they're not willing to recognize the destabilization dangers either. So it just really underscores how the United Nations, in many respects, has been taken over by these Western powers. So we've got to find ways to go around all of these obstacles today.
Now, there's a question from Miro, which I think will have to be our last one, unfortunately. We've got a lot of questions are now flowing in at the last minute. Miro asks the question, how can we challenge the idea that China poses a serious military threat to Australians. Can we start off with Bruce Haigh, and then we'll also invite Kate and Bruce Gagnon to comment. But Bruce Haigh, how can we challenge the idea that China poses a threat to, well, obviously to Australia, but the other two countries as well?
I think we have to look at the history of China. It hasn't shown itself to be an aggressive state, at least not for many centuries. China is really annoyed with the proximity with which the United States has placed bases, positioned itself militarily, flies drones and spy flights and all the rest of it. So it's pushing back against that. And in pushing back against that, China then begins to look like it's an aggressor. There is no easy way. What I was thinking earlier, though, a study needs to be done into the effects of going to war with China, the human cost, the casualties, the effect on trade, the fact that America would damage itself beyond repair. China has a vested interest in seeing the United States survive. It's got money invested there. It wants to trade with the United States. It certainly doesn't want to see the United States collapse. The United States, as we know, is its own worst enemy. But if a study were to be done into the effects of a war, including the use of nuclear weapons, that might cause people to take a step backwards or to pause in their push, which is underway. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Kate?
Yes. Well, in terms of how we counter that in Britain, I mean, it really is exceptionally difficult. I mean, I don't. You've got enough problems on your own plate in Australia and elsewhere, no doubt, to spend time looking at the kind of disaster zone that is Britain. I mean, it's just on every front we're facing so many huge challenges. We've got a probably even more disastrous government now, you know, and COVID disaster, economic disaster, climate disaster, you know, there's now the Ukraine war disaster, and actually getting a serious discussion about the real reasons for things, you know, what is actually going on in the world is very difficult, because the media, it's virtually impossible now to get alternative voices in the media, whereas we used to find it relatively easy to get on serious programs and put the case and our voices were heard. It's like now there's a kind of, you know, block on that at some higher level in the media. So getting our voices heard is very difficult. So that is why I think that point that someone else made, you know, about in international cooperation between the peace movements in particular, that's very, very important, you know, but also with the labour movement as well. I mean, there was a comment in the chat there about, you know, the importance of the trade unions, and also other relatively mainstream political forces that, you know, need to be pulled in too. So, for example, last year at the Labour Party conference, which happened just after the AUKUS announcement, actually the conference voted by over 70% to oppose, that Labour should oppose the AUKUS Pact. You know, that doesn't really go anywhere because the Labour leadership doesn't take any notice of what's voted on at conference. But nevertheless, that is a significant body of activists and political opinion that is opposed to this. But getting the hearing for that, getting the debate in the trade unions is quite difficult, because although some are opposed to AUKUS, on the other hand, because of the jobs issue, there are other big unions who think, okay, well, these are well-paid industrial jobs, working class communities, and so on. You know, so getting that debate out there, working together, getting the links with Australia, the movement in Australia and in the US as well, where they will listen. You know, the unions in Britain are more likely to listen to the unions in the US and Australia than they are to the peace movement in Britain, unfortunately. You know, when it comes to jobs, that is certainly the case. So anything we can do to work together on this, so much the better. And thank you very much.
Bruce Gagnon. How are you going to reduce the anti-Chinese rhetoric in the United States?
Well, first I wanted to say that if I was living in Australia, I don't know if this is possible, but I would be trying to organize peace activists from all over the country to go on a delegation to China and to have people come home and spread the word to all the various parts of Australia about the things that you learned. There's a Chinese Peace and Disarmament Organization there. And in fact, they're having an international call. I don't know if you've all heard or been invited on it in this coming week. They are trying to reach out right now to people around the world. That might be something you might look into very quickly. And lastly, I think it's always to remember there's always an Achilles heel to every plan. And the Achilles heel to this current plan of global domination and war with Russia and China is money, number one, is sanctions, the blowback, the boomerang effect from the sanctions that are now happening. And right now, the way it looks to me is the United States and the EU are heading towards economic collapse. And they're going to have a difficult time paying for all this stuff in the future. So this is something that we've got to be talking more about: money, the economics, the link between this growing militarization and the impacts on poverty and everything else.
Good. Thanks very much, Bruce. I'd just like to remind participants that in the chat box, we've got a number of links and ideas about how we can continue on from this evening, but I now invite Nick Dean to come back online to wind up and to thank the participants for such a stimulating evening. Nick, over to you, please.
You're muted, Nick.
There we go. Thank you, Keith. And thank you, Bruce. And thank you, Bruce. And thank you, Kate. It was very, very stimulating. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot of ideas. And I think we're probably just on the threshold of building a strong movement in Australia. We've got a good ground base for it now. And I'm optimistic about where we're going with the anti-AUKUS campaign. So thank you very much for your contribution to that. And I think that's the other person to thank is you, Keith. Thank you very much for your facilitation. And the only other thing to say is that this has been recorded and it will be up on the website in coming weeks. So thanks again to everybody who's taken part.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
That's it.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
All right.